Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Approval workflows for vendor adds and changes can help to reduce payment fraud and avoidable errors in vendor data. So, for why to do it and how to do it if your system does not support approval workflows, keep listening. Welcome to episode 385, Use an Approval Workflow for Vendor Record Activity and Tips if it's not automated. Most of you know already, and especially I've been saying it a lot this year in these episodes, is that I used to be a practitioner. I was an AP senior manager over global vendor setup and maintenance. I had a team of 17. All we did was vendor setup and maintenance tasks. So we maintained 140,000 vendors across 7 different ERPs, and we processed about 2,000 requests per month. And I have to tell you that back then, we did not have approval workflows set up. And what do I mean by approval workflows? I mean that when a team member goes in and adds a vendor or changes an existing vendor record, that there was no trigger or there was no requirement for anyone to approve it before that vendor record was ready and active for POs and for payment. Today, though, with the fraud that we know that's out there, I do recommend that it be turned on. And I have some tips for how you can implement that approval workflow, even if you don't have it in your systems. And I will tell you that of the 7 systems that I last used, or I use my last position as a practitioner, we actually did have it available to turn on in 2 systems, but not any of the other ones. So, it does depend on your system. Plus, you might even have it in your system, or it can be configured in your system, and you may not know. So, today we're going to talk about why I think you should use an approval workflow, and then give you some tips of how to use it if it's not automated. I'm also going to talk about, some parts of it, like the approvers, talk about them, and then also talk about what to make sure you have if you have this process in place. All right. So we're going to start off with the first thing, how I even came across this or even thought about it. It was because I was reading in a report about fraud, because there are so many reports out there about fraud, specifically business email compromise, AP, and 2026 what should be done. And so this one report I saw, and it's from IOFM, and that's the Institute of Finance and Management. And I'll put a link to where you can download it, but it may require you to be a member. I'm not sure if it does or not. But I'll put a link to it, and if you can download it, great. But one part of this indicated, or one page talked about what you can do to avoid fraud. And one of the things was dual approval for vendor setup. And what it said was that only about half, that's 55% of AP teams, utilize this control. It goes further to say it's important that two authorized people are required to review and approve new vendor additions to your vendor master file. And then lastly, it says that skipping this always or allows a single compromised or dishonest employee to add fictitious vendors for payment fraud schemes. And I agree with all of that. And I don't know why we did not turn that on. Probably because it was only available in two of the seven ERPs or accounting systems that we used. And to have like separate processes, even more separate processes, I should say, because we have different systems, would have been, something that just would have been a lot. But I will tell you, if I had to do it all over again, if we were still doing everything the same way that we were doing it today, I would definitely implement that and put a manual process in place. Luckily, though, for us, we did end up getting or implementing a vendor self-registration portal. And so that would have negated it. Although you always have the instances, those of you that have vendor self-registration portals, you probably don't think that you need to have any manual processes, but you may, because the vendor setup or vendor self-registration portals are not the source of truth. They're not the system of record. And so if you have an individual that has privacy concerns or is protected by privacy laws, that means they can opt out. And so you may have to have manual processes. So you know what? Even if you have a vendor setup, vendor self-registration portal, you may have to have an approval workflow anyway, or in addition to, right, onboarding vendors via the portal. So, you know what? It could happen or be applicable to everyone or all vendor teams. So, with that being said, let's talk about some reasons why I think it should be done. So, first of all, let's just talk about fraud. It will protect or help to reduce or help to identify, I should say it like that, external fraud. And why? Because you have multiple sets of eyes on the request. If it was just the person that, right, received the request, maybe they got it through email, maybe they did a scan of the email, hopefully was able to find or spot any red flags, did not spot any, and so proceeded to process the request. But you know what? Maybe an additional set of eyes can find something wrong with that request. And I'll talk about what to include in the attachment so they can determine it. But, again, having that second set of eyes to review the documents, to review, right, the what's included on the request can help to spot fraud. Maybe that the person processing the request did not see. And then the second one is to deter internal fraud. Many internal fraudsters, they know when the pay cycles run, and so they know if they have access that they can go in and change the vendor's remittance information to their own right before the pay cycle, and then go right back in after the pay cycle and change it back. However, if you have an approval process or approval workflow, then that won't get updated until someone else reviews it. And that someone else reviewing it is a deterrent for internal fraud. So that's great. And another reason is it also can satisfy or be a compensating control if you have a segregation of duties issue. So many of you may have small teams where your invoice processing, your vendor setup, and maybe even your payments are all done by the same person, or a mix of those are done by the same person, right? Vendor setup and, posting the invoice can be the same person. And so a compensating control is for, or with vendor setup, is to have a review or approval of all vendor adds and changes. And then lastly, this is really good too, because it's a second set of eyes, not just for fraud, but also for errors, right? Errors that are just avoidable because, someone fat fingered the banking information. And if that went through, then you're looking at having one, the vendor not paid, and then two, having that payment come back as unsuccessful. And now you got rework to do. And so that's great to find, right, those errors in that are a result of fat fingering. It's also great to just review that it was set up correctly. I know a lot of you use things like groups or categories or accounts that you set vendors up in based on different criteria. And so that can be reviewed as well. So that, and I'm sure you have some reasons why you would like to have your vendor records reviewed before they are active and ready for use. So just add your reasons to the ones that I gave. Now, let's talk about your approvers. So the report that and the verbiage that I read talked about multiple approvers, and I actually have worked with vendor teams that have one approver. There are some that have two approvers. I don't know. I don't remember if the two approvers were based on, the type of vendor it was or any other type of criteria. But if your system has the ability to do that, that might, be able to reduce the number of, second approvers that are additional approvers, I should say, that are required for a vendor record. I mean, if you're setting up a $20 one-time vendor, right, do you really need to have two approvers on that? So you might want to think about or see what your system capabilities are, and then identify the number of approvers to use based on, that the functionality that your system has. So it can be more than one approver, and just understand too that they have to have the ability to view the vendor record and attachments. They should not have the ability to edit the vendor record, because that just introduces the risk of internal fraud. If you have an approver that is an internal fraudster, they can just change the remittance information at that point. So you do want to make sure that your approvers only have access to view the vendor record. Also, they do need to have access to view the attachments if you are attaching the vendor setup documents or the documents used for the request to the vendor record. And if you're not attaching it to the vendor record, if you have it like on a secure drive, then you need to make sure that they have access to that as well. Or better yet, set up a separate secure drive just for the approval process. And then once that vendor has been approved, then you can delete those documents that could have sensitive information, right, in a secure way. And then that way the approvers don't have access to the document that could have sensitive data on it forever, but only during the time that they need it for the approval process. All right. And so the next thing I want to talk about is what to include in the attachments. And these are the vendor setup documents. The another recommended attachment or document I think that you need to include so that these approvers have something to review to determine whether it's a fraudulent request or whether they think there are any red flags, and to determine if you've entered that information in correctly. And so here's what I think they need to have access to. This is vendor setup documents, and this can be on, attached to the vendor record, or it can be on a separate drive, right, just for them to review. So the vendor setup documents, this can be the W-9, a substitute W-9, vendor setup form, also screenshots of the successful validations, right? Because part of the approval process is to make sure that the person followed the correct process. So you do need to make sure that the required validations were done and that they were successful. Also, I recommend you have a copy of the email that requested the add or change. And this is another place that they can look, or another thing that they can look at to determine if there are any red flags that maybe you or the person that created the record or change the existing vendor record might have missed. It never hurts to have a second set of eyes, especially on these emails where they could have some red flags, especially because these fraudsters now are getting very good and they are evolving to hide these red flags that just could be missed. And so having a second set of eyes, a third set of eyes might just be the thing that helps your company to find the fraud and reduce or eliminate payment fraud resulting from a fraudulent email. So a copy of the email that requested the add or change is should be mandatory to include on the vendor record when it did come via email. And then the other thing I think you need to include, and this is not necessarily in the attachments, but just on the vendor record itself, is comments on the vendor record explaining the add or the change, like the reason for the add or the change, or what they did as a part of the add or change. And I have always recommended that comments be added to the vendor record anyway, for audit and other purposes. Someone else coming behind and reading needing to make a change, or looking at the vendor record because maybe they received a request in and maybe they just wanted to see when's the last time it's been updated. That could be another part of, a fraud review or a red flag for a change that they received. And so putting the comments on the vendor record is just a way to explain what was done. And so I do recommend that comments be added to the vendor record. All right. So that's it for what to include in the attachments or as part of the process that will help the approvers to do their job. And then the last section here is what can you do if you don't have an automated process, automated workflow in your accounting system or ERP? Because not all of them have the ability for an automated workflow. And so let's talk about that. First off, when when you or team member, right, processes that adds that vendor to the vendor master file, or processes that change to an existing vendor, rather than having that vendor be immediately available for, a PO that can bind your company, right, to some type of an agreement, or a letter, or a payment, I should say, that can, be to a fraudster immediately. The vendor record itself needs to be not available for those types of activities. And so things like adding a payment hold, things like changing the status or making sure the status is anything but active. And depending on your system, this can be different, right? So you may be looking at some type of a status. You may be looking at maybe some type of a payment hold, anything that will mean that the vendor record cannot be used. And you may need to check with your IT team or your systems team, especially if you don't have documentation on your particular accounting system or ERP, to see what could be done. It could be something totally different, but it needs to be something that will not allow that vendor record to be used until that record has been reviewed and approved. Now, the next part, now that you have the vendor record set so it cannot be used, the next part is, well, how do you notify the approvers? And so I know that uh, a lot of you are going to cringe, but yeah, by email, that is one option. Also, you need to track, and you're going to cringe again, you need to track that you sent the email out, or, someone needs to track whether or not the approvers have actually approved, right, the vendor add or the vendor change. And here's the cringe part. Yes, a spreadsheet. And so that's what you have access to. And let me just say, I do talk to a lot of current practitioners out there, and a lot of you are still using Excel anyway. And so I know, yes, I know. However, you're using it, it's there, it's something that you have access to. If you have another way to do it, great. But if you don't, that is a definite manual way that you can track the requests for approval that you sent out, and then the fact that they have been approved. And if you do, uh, and you do want to make sure that you're not only tracking, right, the pending approvals, but you want to track when it was approved. And then that way, if a vendor has been activated, their status has been changed to active or whatever is required in your system, so that, POs can be issued, so that invoices can post, payments can be made. You need to find a way to track that if it's part of your process, because I also recommend that a vendor audit process be put into place, or audit of your vendor process be put into place, to make sure that all these things you're putting in your process to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data, and make sure they're all being done. And so that means you have to track this step of that process so that you can show that it's being done. Now, I will also say that there are some programs out there, and I am not affiliated with this one. It's just the fact that I've used it before. I've created a quote unquote smart sheet before. And so, one kind of improved Excel process, or Google process, is to use a spreadsheet based program like Smartsheet, where you can track. You can use it to track just like you do in email, but a lot of or in Excel, excuse me, but a lot of the programming and functionality is automated, so it'll automatically send out that email. And you can even set it up to where your approvers have to sign in using, right, their official login information in order to see the request and then record the approval. And that way, it's not relying on someone to keep up a spreadsheet. It's got automated processes within that program. And so you might be able to set that up, right? Excel itself, it does have the functionality to do some automation. So check that out. But again, spreadsheet is always there, and it is something that you can use if you don't have the budget for anything else. Now, another thing that you can do if you don't have an automated workflow is to have the approvers themselves go in and run an audit report of changes to the vendor master file or vendor master file activity. And it can pull the adds and the changes to the vendor master file, and they can identify what records um, to review that way. And then once they have reviewed the vendor record, they can contact you or the team member and let them know that it's either approved or that it's been rejected and why. All right, so that's what I have for you today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 385th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.